we think that is. Okay, cool. Well, I'll just start rambling up here, and please interject and or ask questions and or throw things at me. I have a tendency to kind of mush my words and speak a little bit quickly, and I generally don't like always present things in perfect coherent order. So like if you don't understand something, it's probably because I thought I said a sentence I didn't, and now I'm on like 4 sentences past that, and I need like a, hey, Joe, like, idiot, what the fuck? And then I'll be like, oh, it's this. And we'll go from there. So, yeah. So Cap, the first thing to understand about sort of economics and general economic thought is that it's a social science, right? Like we think that it's a hard science that is like objective and there's numbers and there's crazy amounts of math. We do an awful lot of math, right? But it's not anything, right? An economic model, no matter how complex and complicated it is, just says this is how we think humans will behave. And in economics, it's generally, here's some assumptions about what it means to be rational, what a rational outcome is, and so if you give people, you know, stimulant X or whatever, then they're likely to respond with outcome Y. That is not quite psychology, it's not quite social science, it's this sort of weird interaction with the two, right? Money is not a real thing, right? Like the paper itself doesn't move anywhere, like, you know, balances in the various bank accounts don't just like magic one way or the other. It's all human beings that decide to like spend money on this or not spend money on this, right? So it's a soft science, it's incredibly social, and over like the history of economic thought and development, those sort of social realities often implicate the way these models develop. So when we get to some of these later models, if you're interested, I can like talk more about it, but it's really easy to say, oh, this is how the market responds, because when you're looking around, everyone's making a ton of money. Well, yeah, probably that's the way that this looks. And then when there are big recessions, people change the model, and you know, it's not because economics is different, but it's like, oh yeah, outside my window, that is sort of what it looks like. And so just don't ever forget that none of this is like hard and fast. It's all just sort of social contexts that build these sort of basic blocks. And as far as models go, let me know if this is starting too slow. This is your basis for like every econ model ever. It's an intersection between the price of something and the quantity of something. And this will be the way that we determine how much Coke gets sold, how many people get jobs, or the way wages are made some sort of way. So, has anyone seen these before? We'll do like these kind of things. Sorry, that's a D. Has anyone seen this graph before? Yeah. Show of hands. One? Okay, cool. So what this should represent, right, is what we call a demand function and a supply function, or a demand curve and a supply curve. It's really dirt simple, right? If this is the market for, I don't know, Coke or whatever that is, there's probably one person out there in the entire world who would like pay $1 million for Coke. Like they love it that much. It doesn't matter how expensive it is. Like they would definitely buy that, right? There's probably like one dude there, and he would definitely buy a Coke for, you know, $500 or something like that. There's probably a lot of people that don't even like Coca-Cola a whole lot, and if it was like a nickel to do it, you might drink it like all the time, or at least you drink a lot more of it, right? So if it costs like 5 cents per Coke, you might see, you know, 1,000 people buying it. Make sense? Right? Cheaper stuff, generally people want it more. Expensive stuff, generally people want it less. That's what we call a demand curve. Human beings fall somewhere on that line. Similarly, for supply curves, that's who produces it, right? If only one person wanted a Coke, you probably wouldn't see a lot of firms making a lot of Coke. They don't really want to do that. If 1,000 people want this kind of thing, then you'll see an awful lot of suppliers producing as sort of much as possible. And that intersection is what we call equilibrium. So that's why, you know, call it $1, call it 500 people. That's why consistently every year 500 people buy Coke, and Coke across all stores ranges from like $1 to $1.20. Sort of makes sense? Clear? Beautiful. You could extrapolate this out to a whole bunch of other things, right? This could be maybe inclusive of Coke, and maybe inclusive of cars, and maybe inclusive of, you know, paint, and everything that we produce ever, right? That's what we call aggregate supply and aggregate demand. If you just thought of everything a person buys and everything that a person produces, there's also some sort of general equilibrium that we reach. huge, right? Like a bunch of people make clothing, a bunch of people buy clothing, and you add that into a big bundle, and that's how you find out how much of total stuff is getting made and what the price of that stuff getting made is. In the real world, that looks like employment and wages in some kind of way, right? You need to be making a whole bunch of stuff in order to feed a lot of people. The big debates, the reason that people say spending money is good or spending money is bad, is that there are certain political views where they think that all of the supply in the US is pretty flat. Like honestly, the amount of stuff that we probably make that total amount of stuff all the time. We probably don't make a lot more of it or a lot less of it, it's always like that. And so if that is fixed, then you can't really manipulate demand a whole lot, right? If you were to suddenly increase all your consumption, wouldn't really do anything. If you were to decrease your consumption, wouldn't really do anything. That is basically the argument for and against government spending money on stuff. When you say pass a stimulus package, when you say the government's going to create jobs, what that means is, okay, we want to move this demand out. If you are a lefty, liberal, Keynesian economics person, you think supply is shaped kind of like that. And you think that demand looks kind of like that. If people lose their jobs and they don't have a lot of money, then demand shifts back. When demand shifts back, you used to employ this many people, now you employ this many people, and that's a recession, right? The government should spend a bunch of money, we should buy a bunch of construction projects, we should buy a bunch of painter's skills, we should buy a bunch of stuff that people do, and we can push it back out again, and then people will get money, they'll buy other things, and then will right itself. If you think aggregate supply is kind of, flat like this, then the government spending a whole bunch of money and moving demand all the way out here doesn't really increase the number of jobs very much at all, but it does inflate the price of everything a ton. And that's why people say, don't spend money, you're not going to create any jobs, you'll just crowd out the private market, and then we'll have inflation, and no one's money will be worth anything because the cost of all goods in the entire US has gone up a whole ton. That is generally sort of bad. Making sense so far? Yeah.
Quick question, if supply is flat, is that based on a theory of like we just can't get any more anywhere?
No, the assumption is more that generally people use their productive capacities kind of as much as possible, sort of all the time, and maybe temporarily you're not doing X, but if you let the market sit on it long enough, you're going to be able to, have a big bump. Keynes is the one that says supply really should start to flatten out like this, and that becomes the justification for FDR spending a bunch of money, basically. That went out of vogue for a while in the 80s when Milton Friedman came along and was like, no, governments are silly, markets are really good, and coincidentally in the 80s we were making money hand over fist, and people were like, yeah, it's probably flat again. Then we had this collapse, and you had guys like Paul Krugman come back into vogue, and he's a neo-Keynesian. He's like, no, supply kind of goes like that. Those types of economics debates, the ones you see on the news and stuff, are basically that. How flat do we think supply is a question of how effective we think the government can be at stimulating economies, making economies good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These relationships play out also on an international scale a whole lot. That's why the US produces a ton of food and dumps food everywhere, which is really cheap, and we can do that. Let's get more to that later. But this, I don't know, this I think is important. The last way it's really important is when you're doing a market for labor, right? Because that determines how many people get jobs, and if those jobs are very good jobs. For instance, when you hear the argument, don't let more immigrants in, it's going to mean that nobody can afford anything anymore. It's because here's the supply of workers, immigration comes in, you get a new supply, and everybody's wages, which are up here, just drop that much. This argument is flawed for a lot of reasons because the world is much more complicated than two axes, but that's the sort of thing you hear, right? That's also the reason that people think, that people think you get paid the value of your time, right? People will say, okay, the market sets the wage. Minimum wage laws are bad because they distort this relationship. Minimum wage laws would be down here. That would be bad. things like rent control and stuff, that cap prices would be bad because it disrupts the market's ability to find that perfect, everyone's working, everything is going really, really well. And this will become important if we want to define capitalism. Y'all are pretty quiet. What is capitalism?
Allocation of scarce resources.
Yeah, it's part of it.
The system of the exploitation of labor, produce profit.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Private ownership of the productions of.
Private ownership of production.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to give you all a definition, or at least my interpretation of Marx's definition. I think Marx's definition is probably the right one. It's also the one that only kind of makes sense in a debate context. And full disclosure, I'm a capitalist. I started a small business a couple years ago. That's who I am. I also think Marx is right about a lot of things. So, I don't know, grains of salt from those directions. Marx says that capitalism is unique, right? If capitalism was just, ownership, or if it was just, using tools to produce goods, or if it was just exchanging currency, then capitalism has existed forever, right? The first time a person was like, oh, I can dig more turnips with this stick with a heavy thing on the end of it, that'd be capitalist production. And the first time someone was like, hey, you've got fruit, I've got this deer skin, you want to trade? That would be cap. That's not something that Marx is particularly worried about, right? In fact, I don't think anyone should be particularly worried about that. If there's a thing that is inevitable, humans as social animals are very likely to trade stuff, to make stuff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Marx thinks, because he's a historian, right, that capitalism is a very unique circumstance that occurs during the Industrial Revolution, basically by which profit is possible. Marx says, like, hey, there's these people, we'll call them the bourgeois, they're bourgeoisie, I don't never know how to say it correctly, and that these bougie folks, they make a lot of money, they don't have to do anything. Purely because they own this thing, they get this thing called profit. And that doesn't really make any sense to Marx for the following reasons, right? So Marx is looking at this, and he's saying, okay, this is the way we think of economics, this is the way we think of scarcity, this is the way we think of demand, et cetera, et cetera. And a business somehow makes profit off of these things. So a business has, capital costs, and it's got labor costs. And when you add it up, that's your sort of total cost, right? And he says, the bourgeois make a bunch of profit because somehow total cost plus profit equals market cost. Right? No one would be making money if this was actually accurate. Where does this profit come from? How come if you pay, $5 a month to rent a machine, you pay labor $10 a month, how come you sell a product for 20 and you make 5 in profit? Like, where's the profit value in this equation? Doesn't make sort of any sense to him, right? If, in fact, whatever this value of capital is 5, because that's, you sell so many tractors, you buy so many tractors, tractors cost 5, and this is true for labor. People produce this much value or they don't produce that much value, that is their wage, then the total value should only be 15. How can a market that's rational and that sets itself up with all these actors doing things produce a good that's more than this? And so the following, which if you understand this relationship, means that you understand Marx better than certainly most of the kids that I graduated with, is that labor here is not producing 10 worth of value. The total cost of this good down here is 20, because profit is coming in there. Labor's producing 15 units of value. You're only getting paid for 10 units of value. A worker that purchases, or a business that purchases your services as a laborer and participates in this exchange is not buying the value of their labor. That doesn't translate directly. They are buying the right to your time, and during which time you produce more value than you are compensated for. If you were compensated for the full value the labor added to the product, then the product wouldn't be able to be more expensive, and profit wouldn't exist. That, to Marx, is the magical birth of profit. That is his book, Capital, which is an excellent read and very long. And Marx thinks that relationship is the first time we have capitalism, right? For the first time ever, some dude can just own it, take $5 off the top, and everybody else gets forced into not getting adequate compensation for their labor, right? Now, that on face, should seem kind of unfair. If my labor is worth this value, how come I can't get all of this value just because I don't own the place? That's kind of weird, but, excuse me. Marx also thinks it's kind of dangerous, right? if you're the person who's making this $5 in profit off this equation, what possible incentives do you have for the treatment of labor, right? Capital is fixed for rational decision-making actors. You're doing everything you can to maximize that profit. Capital only produces the value it produces. That's machinery, that's rent, that's paper supplies or whatever. If the only thing that's adding value that contributes to your profit, that means that profit, right, is a finite resource that exists exclusively because the laborer produces more than their compensation. The only incentive you have is to get this number as low as possible while it produces as much value as possible. You want to pay the worker as little as you can while they make the most maximum amount of value, right? The sort of hippie leftist turn that you hear all the time is like, but like, happier workers are more valuable. They do produce, more product. They will sort of make you richer overall. Marx would be like, yeah, kinda, to an extent. But there's no reason, not economically, that you would ever even approach fairness, much less anything else. The bigger problem for Marx is as long as this relationship exists where you're squeezing something out of labor, right? If the cost of labor goes down, that means that people's wages go down, right? Wealth gap goes up and those wages go down. If laborers are making less and less and less and less and less, who's buying most of the stuff? Like rich people buy a lot of stuff for sure, right? But they also tend to hoard it, they hand it down to their kids, they, take it out of state if you're worried about that kind of a thing. The gross majority of consumption doesn't come from the 1%, right? The gross majority of people buying stuff is 99% of folks, right? Now, if the whole system is rigged to depress their purchasing power as much as possible, like, what would happen? Marx thinks eventually the whole thing comes crashing down on itself. There's no use in setting up these big factories and pushing labor down and down and down and replacing it with machinery and machinery and down, exploit, until suddenly there are a whole lot of folks that don't have jobs because you've made as much of it capital-based as possible. Those jobs don't pay anything. There's no more aggregate demand, right? If this is all of the stuff in the world, this is the supply of all the stuff, and aggregate demand is here, if eventually no one can afford to buy the stuff that we're producing, demand is going to go all the way down here. And then employment goes down, money goes down, everything is bad, 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 bad. If the collapse of capitalism is absolutely inevitable, to Marx's mind, the only, not even ethical choice, but the only practical choice, the only thing that makes a lick of sense anywhere, anyhow, anytime, is to start getting ready for that. Because that thing is super inevitable and super terrifying. It is the Malthusian crunch, if you will. It is everyone going crazy, there will be blood in the streets, and that will be awful. So, it's the job of every laborer to be aware of this dynamic, to understand that classes exist, that the system has an incentive by which one's class profit and the other class's wages are in direct competition, and that they're going to fight, and that would be bad. Class warfare is inevitable, organize now so we can try to minimize that damage as much as possible. This also informs a large part of the impact debate to capitalism, right? Questions of inevitable collapses and whatnot drastically change that meaning. That's why a lot of like neo-Marxists who are writing probably cards that in policy you hear read on alternatives all the time is it's try or die for the alt, right? If the absolute collapse is inevitable, then it's 100% bad. Our alternative of like bioregionalism or like abolishing property rights or whatever your alternative to capitalism happens to be, yeah, there might be some disadds to that. Like it might not be a super happy transition from capitalism to a new mechanism of resource exchange and production, but we know that if we don't change it, the worst possible things happen. 100% risk of everything being bad in the quo. Always have to try for the alt. With me? Yeah?
So with that original equation, is that basically saying that the labor, like the individual doing labor, did $15 worth of labor, or that like they did 10 but then a machine or something did that extra 5 that they otherwise would have gotten? Like, is it just addressing human labor or like machine labor?
Yeah, it's mostly,
also?
well, machine labor is kind of constant, right? Like if you're a newspaper firm and your printing press prints X amount of paper for Y amount of energy use, that's just consistent value. And if you can do that cheaper with a machine than a person, you're trying to do it with a machine. But when a person happens, then it's labor that adds value. This is also a crucial difference. Up until this point, the more traditional theory is that goods are valuable because they produce utility, aka like happiness. So you're like, oh man, like people eat Thai food because Thai food's delicious. People buy video games because like video games are fun. Like it represents a certain amount of deliciousness or fun or utility to someone. And the more that happens, then the more a good is worth. So we produce diamonds, and diamonds are expensive because people look at them and they go, oh man, like this makes me so happy and wonderful to have or see a diamond or something, right? Marx is saying, if that was true, if utility was really right, then this labor market would be correct, and people would be getting the value of their labor. But capital and labor, adds up to some number that is much less than, ends up at some number that's much less than the selling price. So where's that value coming from? Now if you change that way of thinking, you think, no, the laborer is not receiving their fair value, like they're adding a ton of value to the product, but they're only getting compensated that much. That explains the existence of profit. That's why when Marx defines capitalism, he says capitalism is a social relationship by which basically profit is possible. A social relationship by which an individual can exist solely in virtue of controlling the means of production, or more flowery language, right? But what he means is never before in history, until the Industrial Revolution, were people just living as a result of being the person that owned the printing press. Now they can because $20 of value is being made, but it only costs them $15 to make it. There's a really, really great book. Was a really great author. If you get a chance, he's from the University of Utah. His name is E.K. Hunt, like letter E, letter K, Hunt. He's really interested in the history of economic thought and that sort of development. And if you're ever really bored, try to find some of his articles or find a textbook. He goes through, not just, well, this person then writes this and it makes sense, this person then writes this because he's correct. He's smart. He says, no, this person writes this because these conditions seem to make that make a lot of sense, right? Keynes comes up with the idea that supply is sloped because they're in the Great Depression when he's about to write. And like, well, if this was correct, depressions are impossible, right? We're always going to be at whatever maximum employment, but no one has a job, so depressions are possible. So this is the new model. And then, Friedman comes up and goes, people have jobs, things are great. The model's more like this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Marx is one of the first thinkers that says, well, yes, this, but more importantly, the entire social organization of it, right? Because econ, as we talked about, is a social science. So what does this mean for debate? Is this readily apparent how it might be useful for any of you yet?
Yeah, basically, it's the act of anything within capitalism, no solvency.
That's certainly a good component of it. And really that capitalism is just socially organized, right? Like capitalism can't be like, oh, you spend money, you're a capitalist. Like, well, no, that just means you exchange something. That's not this particular social relationship. When you want to talk and critique capitalism, you're trying to critique these entire organizational structure, right, to all of this. And that's what should be drawing your harms and what should be taking them away. I think also cap is one of the most interesting critiques because I don't think you ever need to read framework on it. When Marx is talking about this inevitable collapse, when we're talking about the exploitation of labor, meaning that this system can no longer hold itself, that the internal contradiction of capitalism, as he calls it, which forces laborers eventually to the point where they can't afford to buy products, the whole system comes down, that's a uniqueness argument, right? That's a description of the status quo that says, cap is inevitably going away. Collapse, inev. Whatever link arguments the affirmative does, right, probably will interact with, keeping capitalism around, or improving capitalism, or enforcing capitalism, or what have you, which means that we don't get to organize and get ready for this event. The collapse is inevitable. The AF attempts to prop it up. Right, this is every econ advantage you've ever heard. A is unique as the economy is contracting in the status quo. B is the link plan spends a bunch of money. If we don't spend money, the US economy collapses, and the world economy collapses, and resource wars, and extinction, et cetera, et cetera. No. Like, economy's already going to collapse. You're just trying to keep it around a little bit longer. that would be bad. Yeah.
Would you suggest using their uniqueness to further your ASA point?
Yes.
And say, in fact, not only is it inevitable, they're telling us it's right now, like, we're at the moment of the alternative, basically?
I think there's a compelling case to be made for that, for sure. That was definitely easier when, you know, it was like 2009 or sorry, easier in like, yeah, like debating in like 2009, 2012. Because we were just on a recession, and we could literally say like, it's falling apart. we ran out of demand for stuff. We suppressed wages. People couldn't buy things, so we invented credit of massive proportions to buy homes in order to keep CAP coming up a little bit more. And then that fell out because that credit was based on nothing. Mostly these wages that have been suppressed, like, it's over. You can definitely tell that story, and you should. It's just, you know, gotta be ready for it. I mean, most econ advantages just say, econ down, plan increases the economy, and then an econ collapse goes to extinction, right? I think really good cap Ks go, yeah, it's going down. Yeah, your plan would prop it up for a while. But we don't go to extinction, dude. We just kind of like go to socialism. Like, that's all we need to do. And maybe you want an alternative to help guide you to get there, but that's fine. Plus, if anyone reads the econ advantage and says, the system's all gonna go away unless we do the plan, then you're like, haha. Like, normally, it's really hard to win that you change the entire system, but your advantage says the system's going away. Dope. Like, you know, you almost don't need an alt anymore. Just don't do the AF. Let it blow up. And then go this way. Don't go to extinction. Why would you go to extinction? That's bad. Yeah?
Joe, could you talk a little bit more about what are the immediate steps, what takes place in this transition from capitalist market economy to alternative?
Right.
What happens in the next 5 to 10 years?
Right. I think that definitely depends on, I think, what alt text you're reading. There are cap Ks that say, do nothing, and then try to make arguments that say, look, right now, the world is more interconnected than it's ever been, right? We have incredible telecommunication technologies, we get it. People kind of understand that, like, hey, there are people that are poor in Detroit and people that are poor in Nicaragua, and that condition is very similar, and that, like, is not good for either of those two people. So there's a re-understanding of, like, what a class is, and class consciousness means we find a way to provide resources in a different way. You know, one each to his needs, not to his desires, or whatever it was that Marx said. And you can say that that looks like, I don't know, I've seen some alt texts that say owning private property is illegal. Now, every piece of property exists in, you know, the state-controlled hands, and they will make sure everyone's got food, everyone's got a roof, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Government's good. You also hear bioregionalism. No, people are just gonna go live where the natural resources are, and then they'll be able to subsist off of that for a long time, and we'll figure out that sort of organization part as we go. Yeah.
What the answer is for like both those arguments? The first one would be like that leads to a command economy, which sort of breaks down all of that, like Soviet Russia, they used Sears catalogs to, you know, make prices, because they just had smart people thinking like, this is what the price should be, and they were totally wrong. And then the second one would be like, that's going to create a tragedy of the commons, because there's no one to steward these resources, so you're just gonna kill the environment and have a bad system.
Yeah, there are definitely, you know, disads to the alt. We'll talk a little bit about impact turn versus disads to alternatives as it relates to the cap debate, for sure. And which means you get back to basically this inevitability claim, right? I think it would be disingenuous to say that there is or at least I haven't ever seen a cap K whose alt is like, oh man, that does solve like all the problems. Like there's definitely gonna be some problems with changing our entire world order. It is only a question of whether or not those problems are A, hopefully solvable, or B, much less in scope than the problem of what this collapse would actually look like, right? You're right, 90% chance the alternative is a bad idea, 100% chance that cap's are worse. So, the inevitability block, I think, is also a really good place for you to just sort of start hiding and hiding all your favorite scenarios, right? I've given you this like Marxist ideal of why structurally capitalism can't support itself. It needs to grow and incentivizes taking money away from the people that would grow it. that's gonna break down at some point, right? You need to tell that story in a debate sense, but you can also just kind of tell some other stories, right? We overtax aquifers, right? We know that water is really, really necessary for life, like hard to live without water, and yet we are degrading water sources at a rate that is not sustainable, right? We are massively polluting the environment. We have no particular plan going forward. We know it's gonna kill us, but we're not really doing anything about it. You've seen massive wealth disparities over the course of whatever, pick your favorite author who says that this is really, really messed up. There was that guy, I forget his name, he's a French scholar, just did a whole revamp of Marx's Capital called Capitalism in the 21st Century. Excellent book, and basically just filled with that contextualization, saying this inevitability thing is absolutely true, and here's the way it's been playing out, in the latter part of the 1900s. Really, really good. The links to CAP, hopefully, are fairly simple, right? Keep in mind, whenever you're writing this criticism, that your link debate, the more specific your link debate can be, the better. The more falsifiable your link debate can be, the better. Anytime you're running really generic links or non-falsifiable links, that doesn't really have any traction, right? Like, you use money, people exchange things, you own property, well, unless you're gonna abolish all cap, people own things, people possess things, probably not very good. If they spot you something like, oh hey, here is the way we're gonna make the economy better, then that's a pretty good link. If they make any types of assumptions about why creating space to let markets do things or to let the capitalist system solve humanitarian issues, that's probably a pretty good link, right? And lastly, you can run hedge links. Who's got a good operating definition of hegemony?
Essentially, it's just like a sphere of influence, but like, I guess, an expanding sphere of influence.
Yeah, that's definitely, I would think, also sort of like the international and political scholars' definition of hegemony. Has anybody else heard it in other contexts? Yeah.
I don't know, kind of the way that I define it is like, it's like a power struggle almost. So like, it's like in like the mindset, though, it's not necessarily like a real power, so it's like the way that you perceive the power that you have.
Yeah, that's getting at it. Sure, yeah.
A little bit, I think of it as hegemony is the way in which we normalize certain discourses or structures to allow particular people to have more influence and in order to oppress other people, groups
Yeah.
of people.
So when I forget when he was writing, but if you ever heard of him, you should know him, and if you know him, you should definitely read him. A guy named Antonio Grodsky. He's the first one to define this, and he's this Italian guy who's raging against the capitalist system, and he gets arrested. He's sitting in prison trying to figure out what's going on, and what he can't figure out is how come we're not organizing. We know this inevitability thing is true. We know that the system is contradictory and broken. We get this. Why aren't we doing anything about it? He just doesn't understand. And he's writing a time where he's watching wealth go up, 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 so that the 1% gets closer to achieving whatever it is, 20% of global wealth. And he says, how do these people, there's just not many of them, have all this power over everyone all the time? He sees acting within the capitalist system as the proletariat, or as anyone, acting against their own interests. To him, there's not a lot of difference between being a capitalist and poisoning your own drinking supply. Makes no sense to him. His answer is hegemony. When he talks about hegemony, he says that hegemony are sort of the questions, it's exactly what you said. It's the questions that aren't being asked, right? It's a whole way in which we talk about things, we present information, we discuss stuff, so that you never ask the sort of underlying question of why. We get into big fights about, well, how steep and flat is aggregate supply, and does decreasing taxes really matter, and if increasing immigration will move wages up or down or whatever. We don't ask if the system is sustainable, right? When you see everything from a newspaper article to a movie, it's like, oh, a person is born, lives in a capitalist system, achieves happiness or doesn't, and dies, right? That's normal. You're not asking why cap or where is cap, right? Every way in which your life is made normative in some sort of way prevents asking the questions. Because he thinks if everyone asked the questions, we would be overthrowing this shit already. To him, the thing is, No one asks why, and no one is aware, and so they act in their own sort of self-interests. The proletariat censor themselves and do themselves a disservice by not examining those sort of harms. I mean, can you think of a particular discourse, I mean, I don't know, like a book, a movie, a news program you watched that really like problematized capitalism? Like really honestly?
I forget what it's called.
I mean, it's hard. You know, most movies are not interested in examining that question. Most books are not about that. Most sports broadcasts are not about that. You don't ask these things. To Grodsky, that's not ignorance. Like, the people that are in power are very, very, very much interested in the proletariat not asking those questions. Take modern media, right? Modern media exists, like, now, don't really count the internet so much, but think of like TV, you know, movies, stuff like that. 5 companies produce pretty much everything. There's only 5, and those are owned by 3 families. There's a couple that, you know, split into separate companies, but that's it, right? Those people are not, you know, Grodsky would say, particularly interested in us asking, like, how come you guys are the only ones that present information? How come y'all are the ones that approve whether or not this channel shows what news at what hour? Like, you have the power to ask whatever questions you could possibly want, but why, I mean, why would you? You would never ever want that. If you're Ted Turner and you're responsible for 20% of all US media content, right? You're probably not interested in people questioning why one person's ever allowed to own and have so much when a lot of folks don't have a lot. Seems like it's potentially a very, very big problem. Those are your sort of more ideological links, right? Your links to ways in which propping up the system is more insidious than you would think. It tries to expose that the system is everywhere, it is every day, it is present in every sort of power relationship. And honestly, it's how you start getting links of omission, right? Like, you know, that's the difference between a bad link of omission that says, you didn't talk about X, so I get my offense or something like that, and lets you say, no. Playing within the system is intentionally and strategically not asking X, and that is wrong and that is harmful because impacts. Sort of makes sense? This will also become more important later. We can talk about it at the end, but I'll kind of shadow a little bit now. Oh, I don't have a lot of time. This is important when you want to use cap to out left folks. Now, that can go wrong, so be careful with it, right? Have you guys seen the Manarchist Ryan Gosling meme? All right, well, when you get really into critical theory, you spend a lot of time on like Tumblr with grad students, like making snarky jokes about various scholars, and one of the great memes is Manarchist Ryan Gosling, which is about a bunch of stuff in the Occupy Wall Street camps that went wrong. Some people, when they have a really good when they have a certain understanding of hegemony, right, about what is normative, they assume that resistance and struggles now can be hierarchical in some way, right? Like if this is inevitable, and if this is bad, and if this is going to kill everyone, then any attempt to not be addressing this is not playing for the right team. And so there were actually, I forget what his name is, Paul, that was based on his last name, but he used to be an FBI informant. He runs whatever that anarchist syndicate out of New York City is. You know, he busted up like a couple of women's only space tents and like safe spaces, and was telling folks like, we don't have time for these questions, we can get to that after the revolution, like this is Occupy Wall Street, we have a revolution on our hands, like we've got to go fight the capitalists. Anarchist Ryan Gosling, who's all like, yeah, I know you've got problems, but like, revolution first, grr. Just Google it later, that will make more sense, I promise. But when that's done well, it's actually a fairly compelling argument, right? Take a resistance to patriarchy, that might be useful, but if patriarchy is propped up by capitalism, and if capitalism is what makes the most material and worst harms of patriarchy true, then misidentifying the problem and just fighting patriarchy and not understanding that intersection or not understanding the importance of dealing with capitalism first, that's bad. That's why there's a big amount of like fighting basically amongst like radicals, activists, and critical scholars on like whether or not Marxism is good or Marxism is bad. Lots of people say, no, dude, I'm not waiting for your revolution in order to like, fight this particular form of oppression. Other scholars say, no, that understanding of class consciousness is everything. Any revolution you're doing that is not one that makes us all understand that class exists and all make us ask these questions that Grodsky is asking and all actually organize and deal with that, you're on the wrong team. Then you're helping to prop up the evil, there is evil and we have to get rid of it. So hegemony gives you links to normal people, gives you links to other left radical critical arguments as well, if that's the direction that you end up wanting to go. That's what it makes sense? Yeah. A very common answer to critical affirmatives, sort of in fact. Cool. Now let's talk about the impact debate a little bit. What is your favorite cap bad and cap good arguments? Go. Start spitting them at me.
Cap bad, nuclear war, extinction.
All right, so cap causes war.
Cap means no value to life.
Environment, value to life. Anything else?
Military adventure.
Yep.
Of course, that's war, is the first one, war.
Yeah, probably. I mean, war, the environment, and value to life are pretty big ones. These could be explained also in terms of aspects of domination, of commodifying people, of valuing profit over safety or sanitization or catastrophic events, et cetera, et cetera. And you can tell these stories in almost any way you want. I will say that bad cap debaters, or really any critical debaters, right, pick their favorite bad things. What's bad? Poverty's bad. Yeah, cap caused that. What's bad? War. War's bad. Cap causes that. You should try to build your blocks the other way. A bad cap causes war argument is something like, we were not capitalists and we didn't have nukes, now we are capitalists and we have nukes, so cap causes nuclear war. Not a great argument, right? Trying to explain like the incentive production behind the military-industrial complex and the incentive production between profiteering off of certain behaviors, the ability to construct threats as a need to fund those technologies against those behaviors, like, oh yeah, that's a problem. And in a world where you weren't generating profits in the same way, you would solve that, right? That's a flawed incentive, that's bad. Environmental catastrophe, the same exact sort of thing, right? Destroying the environment is only useful insofar as it makes somebody some sort of actual money. And if you can explain the incentive about this particular topic or the particular environmental collapse that you really want to go for as being one of the economic problems, then you all can solve that. Value to life, same exact thing. Exploiting labor, dehumanizing those conditions, creating a system by which one class is interested in the demise of the other, like interested to the tune of profit, that's maybe solvable. Also really good to getting at, just the outright root cause of anything they want to do. It's very easy when you're running a diverse set of impacts like that to say, we will go for our environmental destruction. Environmental destruction turns advantage 1 because X and turns advantage 2 because Y, which means it's only a question of who is good for the environment. We have explained all of the access to environmental harms as a question of flawed incentives. The team that's asking a question about what those incentives are is clearly the negative. What about cap good? Anybody know any reasons capitalism's good?
Innovation.
Innovation, for what?
Everything.
Everything. Yeah.
Medicine.
Huh?
For solving the environment and preventing war.
Right, for the
And
environment,
giving value to life.
for war. That's exactly it, right? The incentive has to be the opposite. No, the tragedy of the commons is a flawed incentive, right? We wiped out all the buffalo. We got a ton of cows. Why? Steak. Like, privatize it. Give it a market. They will live, right? We need green technology, right? We didn't get one. We wouldn't have one unless Toyota made money off the Prius. Go buy a Toyota. Value to life and human freedom. Like, systems that have tried to reject capitalism have not been very good for those things, right? It's not a particularly great place to be in the
You could also argue innovation. I mean, aren't we all glad we have a smartphone?
Yes, also true.
It makes our life so much easier, so much more
Yeah.
convenient, so more, yeah.
Luke
Doesn't
Land-
apply to everybody, but.
One of my coaches, Luke Landry, once said, he said the best one is to do what he called the medieval times check. And he said, think of all the ways if you lived in the Dark Ages, your life would suck. That is an impact turn to cap bad. That is a reason that capital is good. Every way in which your life feels better today than it was if you were a serf in some field, like hauling shit for a king. Like,
Because socialists don't invent anything.
right, no, I mean, for sure. For sure.
It's also an interesting argument that, along the same lines of democracies don't fight democracies.
Mhm.
Market economies don't fight market economies because that is not good for business.
Right. We would never go to war with
War is
China.
good for business in
Except we
other
go to,
ways,
for
and,
Yeah. Yeah. well, war against some people, we make money off of it, but like war against China, we would definitely lose a bunch of money, so we don't do that. Also, markets are stabilizing. Markets provide framework for international relations. Markets provide predictable frameworks for things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a meritocracy. And, you know, the health outcomes, you can't lie, right? You do have to look at them and say, man, people live longer, we tend to live healthier, things are very good for us. The bad debater has to explain there are elements of society and of being a person on earth where we make progress, and that is not caused by capitalism. It is a funny fact of the world that we are socially organized in a way that makes profit possible, and also we learned how to do medicine. We could still do medicine without making medicine super profitable. That nuance is kind of hard to draw out. If you can spit out 22 reasons cap is good on the impact turn debate, it's, you know, challenging. Similarly, when you're giving MOs and that sort of things, you have to group massive amounts of turns, explain why a rejection of this system doesn't necessarily preclude that, and then kind of trust that that will be a sufficient answer to everything, and not having to be like, but you know, you dropped our fourth war turn that's specific to this context, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a hard thing to do. It also means, I know I keep coming back to that, but that's because Marxism is like this inevitability question is everything, right? That makes the impact debate kind of go away. If capitalism is inevitable, if there is no other system that humans can organize themselves by, then trying to resist it and fight it and just putting a bunch of people out of work in the process and making a bunch of people poor in the process, that would be terrible. If capitalism really is the only reason we have medical technology, communication technology, weapons technology, then any move away from cap means we stop doing that. We get worse at medicine right when Ebola breaks out. We get terrible at missile containment at a time of massive proliferation. We have a dip in U.S. hegemony in the international relations standpoint where there's no longer a top dog keeping everyone safe, and there are power vacuums and wars and conflicts. Blah! Inevitability debates are awesome. The simple sort of rule of thumb in debate is if something is inevitable, there's only a risk it's good. If you start structuring your arguments as such, they will be good for you. Your alternative, in 5 minutes or less. Your alt should, to the best of its ability, not be permeable, obviously, right? Ideological shifts are possible alternative texts. They can be kind of difficult because you have to win all the ways in which lots of people can change their mind. We already talked about how if somebody gives you an economics advantage or claims that the economy will collapse absent plan, you don't even really need an alt text. I mean, you could be like, workers should organize, or something like that, but you're going to get spotted that that sort of happens. I also think that in the cap debate, because you will want to be spending your time on the intersection between inevitability and impact arguments, that sometimes people do way too much. A really clunky cap alternative that really does a ton of things, gives good MGs and good PMRs a lot of ways to do the plan while helping elements of the transition occur, right? You want the transition to occur from capitalism to the new thing because of necessary forces, right? If that transition occurs too much because your alternative is awesome and you really do make all of the workers of the world get along and hold their hands, then you're going to be okay keeping the economy around for a little bit longer while you do that. It'll be really okay to adjust interest rates and also sort of let that happen, right? The strength of transitioning from capitalism when you're debating well is because of the internal contradictions of the system and those vulnerabilities, not because your alt is super boss and solves everything. I think strategically that is where you should be spending the bulk of your time. I also think that alts are difficult because most of them come with big stick disads. The ones you hear on cap most often are pretty simple. The first is a transition war, right? Like, honestly, like, the bourgeois are not going to be stoked about not being able to make lots of money. They will fight people to try to keep their money. That will be bad. I think that transition argument pairs really well with something that called seeding the political, which says, man, if we all get radical, we all decide, like, we're not playing government anymore, we're not playing anything that's in the system, and we remove ourselves, the system doesn't immediately collapse, right? Because right now, within the system, who's got the guns? And who's got the organized military that can talk to itself and can run away? Who's got every material advantage? And if you don't have some of the good guys, like chilling in Congress, making their case for you and your interests, then when this transition occurs, you said, all right, well, we don't have anybody in the police department that's here to put a check on abuse of power. We just have, like, a very bad, like, bourgeois influence telling the cops, yo, those guys are bad. and they become their bosses. That looks really bloody and really bad for the process of revolution. Man, you could lose a lot of inevitability claims, you could lose a lot of impact claims. You probably don't want to just leave you and all your friends unarmed, alone, facing the army. Yeah.
We have some pretty good real-world examples of that called, Western Iraq and Eastern Syria,
Yes.
Afghanistan, where you see that collapse of that state. In those instances, not a market economy, but when you see that collapse of authority, same is going to be happening when a lot of these collapse they say the state will go with it. When that happens, you create that power vacuum, everybody rushes for control, and it ends up being left in the hands of those who were able to have power anyway. That's why the Islamic State is so capable to recruit fighters, because they're the wealthiest.
Yes.
They've got money, 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 money. ISIS is loaded with cash.
Yes, they are. Right? Also, I think you could hide solvency claims in that inevitability block, right? If part of the reason the collapse is inevitable is because the system is contradictory, it also might be the case that more and more people are aware of that now more than ever. Occupy Wall Street, I think, is a fairly good example. People like to say, man, Occupy Wall Street didn't do anything, they didn't have a message or whatever. I would submit that now we have this terminology called the 1% and the 99%, right? That they are a member of the 1% is this rhetorical artifact that is super specific, that targets exactly a few amount of people that can now be held accountable for a massive disparity in the material advantage they have versus 99% of the world. If that's not demonstrative of a shift towards more people being aware of class consciousness and the existence of class, I don't know what is. If you start hiding arguments like that in your inevitability claims as reasons that people are talking to one another, reasons that people will collapse, it gives you all of the strength in the world to fight back against those sort of disads to the alt. The likelihood that all of the cops start beating all of the protesters right away is much less when cops start to realize they don't make a lot of money too, and they're not working out really well too, and their families are part of this system and part of this class that's getting exploited too. Brandon Rivera is really likes the phrase co-opt the cops, and that's like what you have to be starting to make arguments for. Like, these are people that are invested and they care. It really is just the 1% that benefits, and if 99% of us can figure that out, then it won't continue on anymore. Those are hidden solvency arguments to your alt. Those are hidden and spike answers to disads to the alternative. That takes away much of the offense, and when you're hiding it correctly, people get up and say, capitalism is sustainable, we are inventing the Prius, and we've got some water, and it's, labor markets are recovering, and next argument, right? It doesn't seem like people are connected, people are communicating. It doesn't seem like a big part of offense. Massively matters in the alternative. Massively, massively. Anybody have any, I'm really sorry that I've got more, but we're out of time. I wanted to have more time for questions and things, but we can spitball a few of them sort of right now, if anybody has particular questions. Anything we didn't really get to. Okay. In that case, I guess y'all are super free to go. Thanks for coming to the lecture, guys.